My name is Amelia, and I'm 32 years old. Tonight I'm standing in my empty kitchen preparing dinner for one again. Through the window I can see my in-laws' house across the street, blazing with lights and laughter. The Preston family dinner is in full swing with cars lining their driveway. My phone buzzes with a text from my husband Daniel. Family dinner tonight at Mom's. I'll be late. My heart sinks because once again, I wasn't invited to my own family's gathering. Before I share what happened next, I'm curious where you're watching from. Please hit that subscribe button if you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to like this video. Now let me take you back to where this painful journey began, and trust me, you'll want to hear how a single knock on the door changed everything. 5 years ago, I was just a simple teacher grading papers in a small coffee shop in downtown Boston when Daniel Preston walked into my life. He ordered a black coffee and accidentally bumped into my table, sending my stack of essays flying everywhere. As we both scrambled to pick them up, our eyes met, and he smiled this genuine warm smile that made my heart skip. What Daniel didn't know then, and what I carefully kept from him during our early dating days, was that I wasn't just any teacher. I was Amelia Sinclair, daughter of William Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Industries, one of the largest tech conglomerates on the West Coast. 3 years before meeting Daniel, I had walked away from a $500 million inheritance because I wanted to make my own path to be valued for who I was, not for my father's money. Daniel pursued me with the sweetness of someone who thought he was dating beneath his social status, which I found ironically amusing. He would take me to fancy restaurants and apologize that they weren't fancier. He would buy me expensive gifts and worry they weren't expensive enough. If only he knew that I had grown up with private jets and yacht parties. After 6 months of dating, Daniel decided it was time to meet his family. I remember that Sunday afternoon perfectly. The Preston estate in Beacon Hill was impressive, all red brick and white columns, but nothing compared to the mansion I grew up in. Daniel was nervous, adjusting his tie repeatedly as we walked up the stone steps. Margaret Preston answered the door herself, which I later learned was unusual since they had staff. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, taking in my simple sundress and modest jewelry. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows raised slightly, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Richard Preston was in his study, surrounded by law books and certificates. When Daniel introduced me as a public school teacher, Richard's handshake became noticeably limper. He asked about my family background, and I simply said my parents lived in California and that I had been independent for years. Victoria, Daniel's sister, arrived late, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to judgment. She was a senior associate at a prestigious law firm and made sure to mention it within the first 2 minutes. When she learned about my profession, she laughed and said it must be so refreshing to have summers off. Christopher, the youngest Preston, was finishing his residency at Massachusetts General. He barely looked up from his phone during dinner, except to ask if I had gone to community college. When Daniel corrected him, saying I had graduated from Stanford, there was a moment of surprise. But Margaret quickly steered the conversation back to Christopher's upcoming fellowship. The dinner was served in courses by their housekeeper, each dish more elaborate than the last. Margaret made pointed comments about the silverware pattern being in the family for generations and how important it was to maintain certain standards. When I complimented the soup, she smiled coldly and said it was a recipe from Richard's grandmother, who was a descendant of the Mayflower passengers. Our engagement came 8 months later. Daniel proposed on a beach in Cape Cod, just the two of us, which was perfect. When we announced it to his family the next day, the silence was deafening. Margaret finally spoke, saying at least we weren't rushing things. Richard asked if we had considered a prenuptial agreement, while Victoria wondered aloud if I understood what I was marrying into. The wedding planning became a battlefield I didn't even know I was fighting. Every suggestion I made was politely dismissed. My idea for wildflowers was replaced with Margaret's choice of imported roses. My preference for a small ceremony became a 200-person affair filled with the Preston family's business associates and society friends. Even my own guest list was scrutinized, with Margaret suggesting that perhaps some of my teacher friends might feel out of place. Our wedding day should have been the happiest day of my life, but I spent most of it feeling like a guest at someone else's party. Margaret insisted on approving my makeup and hair-making adjustments until I barely recognized myself. The photographer spent more time on Preston family portraits than on pictures of Daniel and me together. During the reception, I overheard Victoria telling her friends that Daniel had always been prone to charity cases. Christopher made jokes about how at least I could help their future children with homework. Not one Preston family member spoke to my parents who had flown in from California and looked increasingly uncomfortable as the evening wore on. My parents pulled me aside before they left, my mother touching my face gently. She asked if I was sure about this, if these people knew who I really was. I assured her that I wanted to build my life on my own terms, that Daniel loved me for me. My father, who had built an empire from nothing, looked at the Prestons holding court across the room and shook his head slightly. After our honeymoon in Greece, which was beautiful but lonely, since Daniel spent half of it on work calls, we settled into married life. I had moved into Daniel's downtown apartment, a beautiful space with views of the harbor. The first week back, I made Daniel's favorite lasagna and suggested we invite his family over for dinner. He hesitated, then said his mother preferred hosting at their house. I tried everything those first few months. I sent Margaret flowers for her birthday, only to see them relegated to the powder room when we visited the next week. I bought Richard a first edition of his favorite legal text for Christmas, and he thanked me with the same enthusiasm one might thank a cashier. When Victoria had a big case victory, I sent champagne to her office, but she never acknowledged it. The exclusion started small. Daniel would mention a family brunch after the fact, saying it was just a quick thing. Then there were the holiday traditions I learned about only through Daniel's stories. The Preston family had a standing reservation at their country club every Sunday, but somehow there was never room for one more. That first Thanksgiving as a married woman was when I truly understood my position in the Preston family. I had spent 3 days preparing my grandmother's apple pie recipe, the one that had won contests back in Ohio where she grew up. It was my contribution to the family dinner made with love and hope that sharing something personal might bridge the gap. When we arrived at this Preston house, the kitchen was buzzing with caterers. Margaret looked at my pie carrier with surprise, as if I had brought something inappropriate to a formal event. She took it from my hands with 2 fingers like it might contaminate her, and without a word dropped it into the trash can. The sound it made hitting the bottom echoed in the sudden silence. Victoria actually smirked while Christopher muttered something about store-bought crusts. Daniel said nothing. He just guided me to the living room where his aunts and uncles were gathered, none of whom had attended our wedding due to various convenient excuses. They looked at me with polite disinterest, the kind reserved for temporary inconveniences. Christmas Eve was even worse. The Prestons had a tradition dating back 40 years of gathering for midnight mass, followed by opening one present each. When December 23rd arrived and I hadn't heard anything about timing, I asked Daniel what time we should arrive at his parents' house. He looked uncomfortable and explained it was a family-only tradition that spouses were included only after 5 years of marriage. When I pointed out that Victoria's husband was going and they had been married only 3 years, Daniel mumbled something about different circumstances. I spent that Christmas Eve alone watching old movies and trying not to cry. Daniel came home at 3 in the morning, smelling of his mother's perfume and his father's cigars, carrying a plate of leftovers that I didn't touch. For Margaret's 65th birthday, I searched for weeks for the perfect gift. I finally found a vintage Hermes scarf in the exact shade of blue she always wore. I had it professionally wrapped with a handwritten card expressing my hope that we could grow closer. At the party, which I learned about only because Daniel mentioned needing to leave work early, Margaret opened my gift, glanced at it, and immediately handed it to her housekeeper, instructing her to add it to the donation pile for the church auction. When Margaret fell ill with pneumonia that spring, I called every day to check on her. Not once did anyone answer or return my calls. I sent soup from her favorite restaurant flowers and get well cards. Daniel would update me on her condition, but when I suggested visiting, he said she wasn't up for company. Yet Victoria's Instagram showed a steady stream of family members at the hospital. The group chat discovery happened by accident. Daniel's phone was charging in the kitchen when it buzzed repeatedly. I glanced at it thinking it might be important and saw a WhatsApp group called Preston Family with 23 members. The recent messages were about planning Richard's 70th birthday party. There were venue suggestions, menu discussions, and guest list debates. My name wasn't mentioned once, not even as Daniel's +1. When I confronted Daniel about it, he seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset. He said it was just easier to plan things without having to explain family dynamics to outsiders. The word outsider hit me like a physical blow. 2 years of marriage and I was still an outsider. Daniel began spending more time at his parents' house. Tuesday dinners became a regular thing which he attended alone. Saturday golf with his father and Christopher excluded me. Sunday brunches at the country club were for Preston blood only. He would come home and tell me stories about these gatherings, oblivious to how each word carved out another piece of my heart. I started making excuses to visit my own parents in California more frequently. My mother noticed the sadness in my eyes, but didn't push. My father, less subtle, asked point-blank if the Prestons knew about our family's wealth. When I said no, he sighed, and said I was playing a dangerous game with my happiness. The pattern became predictable. Every family milestone, every celebration, every tradition happened without me. Daniel would apologize, half-heartedly, promise things would change, then disappear into another family event that didn't include me. I began to feel like I was married to a ghost who only materialized between family obligations. Work became my refuge. My students didn't care that I wasn't a Preston by blood. They loved Miss Amelia, who read stories with different voices and stayed late to help with homework. The other teachers became my surrogate family, inviting me to their homes for dinner, including me in their celebrations. One particularly painful evening, I was walking past the Preston house on my way home from the grocery store. Through the dining room window, I could see the entire family gathered around the table. Daniel was laughing at something Christopher said. Margaret was holding court at the head of the table, and Victoria was pouring wine. It was a random Thursday, no special occasion, just a family dinner I hadn't been invited to. I stood there in the dark, holding my grocery bags with ingredients for a dinner I would eat alone, watching my husband's real life play out without me. An elderly neighbor walking her dog stopped beside me, following my gaze. She patted my arm gently and said she had wondered when Daniel got divorced, since she never saw me at family gatherings. That night, I made myself an elaborate dinner, set the table for one with my grandmother's china, and opened a bottle of wine I had been saving. If I was going to be alone, I decided I would at least treat myself with the respect the Prestons wouldn't give me. Daniel came home around 11, full of his mother's pot roast and family warmth. He kissed my forehead absently and headed straight to bed, not noticing the fancy table setting or the fact that I was still in my work dress. I sat at that table until midnight, finishing the wine and wondering how much lonelier a marriage could get. The 40th wedding anniversary celebration of Richard and Margaret Preston was the social event of the season. I knew about it only because the florist, who also did arrangements for my school, mentioned delivering $3,000 worth of flowers to the Harbor Hotel for the Preston anniversary party. When I casually brought it up to Daniel that evening, he froze mid-bite of his dinner. The guilty look on his face told me everything before he even opened his mouth. He said it was mostly his parents' friends, that it would be boring, that he was only stopping by briefly. Each lie fell between us like another brick in the wall, separating our lives. I might have let it go, might have swallowed this indignity like all the others. Except I saw Victoria's Facebook post the next morning. She had shared a save the date from 2 months ago for the celebration of 4 decades of love and family. The comments were full of Preston relatives and friends expressing their excitement about attending. Daniel had known for months and deliberately kept it from me. That Saturday afternoon, I put on my best dress, the deep emerald one that Daniel had once said made my eyes sparkle. I did my makeup carefully, styled my hair in an elegant updo, and drove to the Harbor Hotel. I told myself I was done being excluded, done accepting their treatment. The ballroom entrance was decorated with gold and white flowers, photos of Richard and Margaret through the years displayed on easels. I could hear music and laughter from inside. I walked up to the registration table with my head held high. The young woman working the table smiled politely and asked for my name. When I said Amelia Preston, she scanned her list, then scanned it again. Her smile faltered as she called over a supervisor. They whispered together, looking at me awkwardly. Finally, the supervisor said there must be some mistake that I wasn't on the guest list. I insisted there was no mistake, that I was Daniel Preston's wife. The supervisor's eyes widened with recognition, and even worse, pity. She said she would need to check with the family. I stood there for 10 humiliating minutes, while other guests walked past me, some recognizing me and whispering behind their hands. Margaret herself finally appeared, looking regal in a silver gown. She didn't seem surprised to see me. In fact, she looked almost pleased, as if I had finally played into some trap she had set. She told the supervisor that I was confused, that this was a private family celebration with limited space. Then she turned to me and suggested in a voice loud enough for others to hear that perhaps I should wait for Daniel at home where I belonged. The security guard who escorted me out was gentle, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He mentioned his own daughter was a teacher and that he thought we were undervalued. I sat in my car in the parking garage for an hour watching Preston guests arrive in their finest clothes, all of them belonging in a way I never would. Through the hotel's glass walls, I could see into the ballroom. Daniel was there in his best suit, the one I had helped him pick out. He was laughing, champagne glass in hand, standing next to a beautiful blonde woman I didn't recognize. She touched his arm when she laughed, and he didn't move away. Margaret watched them with an approving smile. Victoria was holding court with a group of young professionals. Christopher was charming an elderly couple who were probably important donors to the hospital. They all looked so perfect together, a family portrait that had no space for someone like me. I drove home in a daze, my humiliation morphing into something harder, angrier. When Daniel finally came home after 2 a.m, smelling of perfume that wasn't mine, I was sitting in the dark living room, still in my dress. The confrontation was ugly. I accused him of being a coward, of choosing his family over his wife. He accused me of being dramatic, of not understanding how family dynamics worked. When I told him about being turned away at the door, he had the audacity to say I shouldn't have shown up uninvited. I asked him who the blonde woman was. He said her name was Catherine, daughter of his father's business partner, someone the family had always hoped he would marry. When I asked if he wished he had, his silence was deafening. That night I slept in the guest room for the first time. Daniel didn't try to stop me. I could hear him on the phone with someone, probably his mother, his voice low and frustrated. The word divorce floated through the door, though I couldn't tell if it was a threat or a promise. I spent Sunday looking at apartments online, calculating if my teacher's salary could cover rent. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had millions sitting in a trust fund I refused to touch, while contemplating whether I could afford a studio apartment. My pride had cost me so much already, but it was all I had left. Monday morning brought a text from Margaret. It was the first time she had ever contacted me directly. All it said was that perhaps it would be best if I considered whether this marriage was truly what I wanted. The subtext was clear. They wanted me gone. Daniel avoided me for 3 days, coming home late and leaving early. When we finally talked, he suggested couples counseling, but only if I could try harder to understand his family's perspective. The fact that he thought the problem was my understanding rather than their treatment told me everything about where his loyalties lay. I made my decision that night. I would give it 1 more month until after the holidays. If nothing changed, I would file for divorce and return to California. I had tried to build a life based on love, but love without respect was just another form of loneliness. What I didn't know was that my father had been keeping tabs on me through his security team. He knew about every humiliation, every exclusion, every tear I had cried alone. And he had finally decided that enough was enough. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. My brother Jason's voice was controlled but urgent. Dad had been in a car accident on Highway 1. A drunk driver had hit his Mercedes head on. He was in surgery at Cedars-Sinai, and they weren't sure if he would make it. I threw clothes into a bag while booking the first flight out. Daniel was in the guest bedroom where he had been sleeping lately. When I woke him to explain, he mumbled something about an important deposition and went back to sleep. I left without saying goodbye. The flight to Los Angeles felt eternal. I kept thinking about my last conversation with my father, how he had asked if I was happy and I had lied. He had built Sinclair Industries from a small software startup in our garage to a tech empire worth billions, but he always said his greatest achievement was our family. My childhood had been privileged but not spoiled. Dad insisted we understand the value of money and hard work. I had internships every summer, not cushy executive positions, but real entry-level jobs where nobody knew who I was. When I told him I wanted to teach to make a difference in children's lives, he had supported me completely. The falling out came when he wanted to announce me as his successor. I was 25, fresh out of my master's program, and the board was pressuring him to name an heir. The announcement would have come with a trust fund of $500 million and eventual control of a company worth 10 times that. I had refused. I wanted to earn my own way to be valued for my contributions, not my inheritance. The argument that followed was the worst we ever had. Dad accused me of being ungrateful, of throwing away everything he had built for me. I accused him of trying to control my life with money. I left that night and hadn't been back to the family compound since. Jason met me at the hospital. My younger brother had taken the opposite path, embracing his role as heir apparent. He was everything a tech dynasty could want in a successor, brilliant, ruthless when necessary, and completely devoted to the company. But when he hugged me in that sterile waiting room, he was just my little brother scared of losing our father. The surgery took 16 hours. Mom arrived from her art retreat in Santa Fe looking older than I remembered. We sat together in silence, mostly the years of distance evaporating in the face of potential loss. She held my hand the same way she had when I was little and scared of thunderstorms. When the surgeon finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, saying Dad would pull through, we all cried. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the guilt. I had wasted 5 years being proud and stubborn while my father had aged without me there. They let me see him the next day. He looked small in the hospital bed, nothing like the titan of industry who commanded boardrooms. When he opened his eyes and saw me, he smiled and whispered he was sorry. I told him there was nothing to forgive, but he shook his head. Over the next 3 weeks, I barely left his side. We talked about everything we had avoided for years. He told me about his own father who had died when Dad was 20, leaving him with nothing but debt and determination. He understood my need to forge my own path because he had done the same. He also told me about the private investigators' reports he had received about the Prestons. He knew about every snub, every exclusion, every tear. He had wanted to intervene a dozen times, but respected my wishes to handle my own life. But watching me suffer from afar had been killing him slowly. Daniel called sporadically during those weeks, his anger growing with each conversation. He couldn't understand why I needed to stay so long for someone I hadn't spoken to in years. When I tried to explain the complexity of family relationships, he actually laughed and said I was being hypocritical, given how I complained about his family loyalty. Margaret left me a voicemail saying that abandoning one's husband during the holiday season was unconscionable. Victoria sent a text saying I was proving what they had always suspected, that I wasn't really committed to the Preston family. The irony of being accused of lack of commitment by people who had never accepted me wasn't lost on me. Dad improved steadily. By the second week, he was walking the halls with a physical therapist, charming the nurses with stories of early Silicon Valley. He had a room full of flowers from tech luminaries, visits from senators and celebrities. The nurses whispered about who he was, this legend of American business recovering in their ward. Jason and I grew closer during those weeks. He told me about the pressure of being the chosen heir, how he sometimes envied my freedom. He also told me that Dad had never removed me from his will, that the CEO position was still mine if I wanted it. The board had been fighting him on it for years, but Dad had refused to budge. Mom and I reconciled in the hospital cafeteria over terrible coffee. She told me she understood why I left, that she had done something similar when she was young, walking away from her family's oil money to become an artist. She had met Dad at a gallery opening where he was the only person who didn't know who she was. They had fallen in love as equals, something she wanted for me too. The conversation that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon. Dad was being discharged the next day, and we were discussing his recovery plan. He looked at me seriously and said he was done watching me be mistreated. He wanted to fly to Boston to meet these Prestons, who thought his daughter wasn't good enough. I begged him not to interfere, but he had that look I remembered from my childhood, the one that meant he had already made up his mind. He said 5 years of respecting my wishes had brought nothing but pain. It was time for a different approach. I flew back to Boston that night knowing everything was about to change. Daniel was furious when I walked in, 3 weeks of resentment spilling out. He accused me of having an affair, of using my father's accident as an excuse to escape our problems. When I told him my father was planning to visit, he laughed bitterly and said at least someone's family cared enough to travel. The irony was sharp enough to cut. His family, who lived 20 minutes away, couldn't include me in a dinner, but my father would fly across the country for me. I went to bed that night knowing my marriage was over, but not knowing that its end would be more spectacular than I could imagine. The following Friday evening started like so many others. Daniel had gone to his parents' house for their weekly family dinner, leaving me with a mumbled excuse about discussing some legal matter with his father. I was grading papers at the kitchen table, a glass of wine my only company, when my phone rang. It was Jason. Dad had taken the company jet to Boston that morning without telling anyone. He had brought a small entourage, including our family lawyer and 2 security guards. They were en route to Beacon Hill. I tried calling Dad to stop him, but he didn't answer. Panic rose in my throat as I imagined the confrontation about to unfold. I grabbed my coat and drove to the Preston house, hoping to intercept my father before he arrived. But as I turned onto their street, I saw the motorcade already there, 3 black SUVs with California plates lined up outside the Preston estate. I parked haphazardly and ran up the driveway, but the front door was already open. I could hear voices from inside, Margaret's shrill tone mixing with deeper masculine voices I didn't recognize. I stepped inside to find a scene I will never forget. The entire Preston family was gathered in their formal living room, frozen like a tableau. Margaret stood near the fireplace, her face pale, one hand clutched to her pearl necklace. Richard had half risen from his leather chair, his mouth open in shock. Victoria and Christopher sat on the sofa looking like children who had been caught doing something wrong. And there in the center of the room stood my father. William Sinclair commanded the space despite being in a wheelchair from his accident. He wore one of his signature charcoal suits, his presence filling the room with an authority that made Richard Preston look small in comparison. When my father saw me in the doorway, his face softened. He said the words that would shatter the Prestons' carefully constructed world. "Where is our daughter? I've come to take her home." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Margaret laughed, a nervous, uncertain sound. She said there must be some mistake. But when my father introduced himself properly, William Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Industries, her laughter died. I watched the recognition dawn on their faces one by one. Richard's legal firm had tried to court Sinclair Industries as a client for years. Christopher had applied for a fellowship funded by our family foundation. Victoria's law firm represented several companies that Sinclair Industries had either acquired or crushed. They all knew exactly who William Sinclair was. Margaret sank into the nearest chair, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She kept looking between me and my father, trying to reconcile the teacher she had thrown away pie from with the heiress standing in her living room. Daniel found his voice, first accusation sharp in his tone. He demanded to know why I had lied, why I had hidden this from everyone. The hurt in his voice might have moved me once, but after years of his family's treatment, I felt only a cold satisfaction. I stepped forward. my voice steady and clear. I told them I had never lied. They had never asked about my family beyond their initial dismissive assumptions. They had been so certain I was beneath them that they never bothered to truly know me. I chose to teach because I loved it, not because I had no other options. My father took over then, his voice carrying the power of someone used to being heard. He told them about my Stanford education, summa cum laude with a double major. He mentioned my master's degree from Harvard, which I had earned while running a nonprofit that provided free tutoring to underprivileged children. He listed my accomplishments, each one landing like a blow to the Preston's prejudices. Then he revealed what even I didn't know. For the past 5 years, I had been anonymously donating $50 million annually to various educational charities through a trust my grandmother had left me. Schools had been built. Scholarships funded, teachers supported, all under pseudonyms to avoid recognition. Victoria actually gasped when Dad mentioned that I had turned down a board position at the Metropolitan Museum, something her social climbing heart would have killed for. Christopher's face reddened when Dad noted that I had funded the very fellowship he had been rejected from twice. But the most satisfying moment was when Dad addressed Margaret directly. He told her that in his 60 years of business, he had met all types of people. But rarely had he encountered someone so blinded by petty snobbery that they couldn't recognize genuine worth when it sat at their table. He said I had graced their family with my presence and they had treated me like hired help. Margaret tried to recover, standing on shaky legs and approaching me with outstretched arms. She suddenly remembered how much she had always admired my dedication to teaching. She recalled lovely conversations we'd supposedly had. She even claimed she had been planning to invite me to a special mother-daughter luncheon just next week. The desperation in her voice was pathetic. Richard joined in, talking about how family misunderstandings happened, how they had simply wanted to give me space to adjust. Victoria mentioned that she had always respected my career choice, while Christopher suddenly recalled how intelligent he had found my conversations. Their transparent attempts at rewriting history might have been funny if they weren't so insulting. 5 years of exclusion couldn't be erased with 5 minutes of false flattery. Daniel remained silent through all of this, his face cycling through emotions I had never seen before. Anger, hurt, confusion, and something that looked like grief. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. He asked why I had done this, why I had made a fool of him. I laughed then, not kindly. I told him he had made a fool of himself by choosing his family's prejudices over his wife's pain. Every time he left me alone while attending family dinners, every excuse he made for their behavior, every moment he failed to defend me had been his choice. The room erupted then. Margaret actually fell to her knees, begging me to forgive them, saying they didn't know, couldn't have known. Richard tried a different approach, suggesting we could all benefit from a fresh start, perhaps some business collaboration between the families. Victoria and Christopher just stared, their entire worldview shattered. Dad watched all of this with cool disdain. When the pleading and bargaining died down, he delivered his final blow. He announced that I would be returning to California to take my rightful place in the family business. The East Coast division of Sinclair Industries needed new leadership, and he couldn't think of anyone better than his daughter to run it. The Preston family would of course be blacklisted from any future business dealings with Sinclair Industries or its hundreds of subsidiaries. He said this casually, like mentioning the weather, but everyone in the room understood the devastating implications for Richard's law firm and their various business ventures. Daniel finally found his anger then. He accused me of planning this all along, of marrying him as some sort of twisted revenge plot. The accusation was so absurd I actually laughed. I told him I had married him because I loved him, had believed he loved me too. But love without respect, love that couldn't stand up to family pressure, love that left me alone while choosing others, wasn't really love at all. I told him I wanted a divorce. The words fell into the room like a bomb. Daniel tried to argue, to plead, to threaten. He cycled through promises to change, accusations of betrayal, and declarations of love that now rang hollow. Margaret made one last desperate attempt. She asked what they could do to fix this, how they could prove they accepted me now. The fact that she thought acceptance could be turned on like a switch after years of rejection showed she still didn't understand the damage they had done. I stood in that living room looking at each Preston face in turn. 5 years of suppressed words finally found their voice. I told them about every holiday spent alone while they gathered as family. Every birthday they ignored, every achievement they dismissed, every moment they made me feel worthless in my own marriage. I spoke about the pie Margaret had thrown away, how that simple act of cruelty had set the tone for everything that followed. I described standing outside their house in the rain, watching them celebrate Thanksgiving through the window, while I held a takeout container of Chinese food. I told them about the security guard at their anniversary party, whose kindness had meant more than any gesture they had ever made. Victoria tried to interrupt, saying they hadn't meant to be cruel, that it was just their way. I asked her if she would accept being treated as an outsider in her own marriage. Her silence was answer enough. Christopher attempted to minimize the situation, calling it a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. I reminded him of the time he had introduced me to his girlfriend as the help when I was serving appetizers at a party I hadn't been invited to as a guest. His face flushed red at the memory. Richard Ever, the lawyer, tried to shift blame. He suggested that if I had been more forthcoming about my background, things would have been different. I asked him if he would have treated any teacher, regardless of their family wealth, the way they had treated me. His inability to answer spoke volumes. But it was Daniel's response that hurt the most, and vindicated my decision simultaneously. He stood there still processing everything, and his primary concern wasn't the pain I had endured, but the embarrassment he felt. He kept saying I had made him look stupid, that I had humiliated him in front of his family. Not once did he apologize for choosing them over me. Not once did he acknowledge the countless times he had left me behind. Even now, faced with the truth of their cruelty and my pain, he was still more concerned about his standing with them than our marriage. My father had been silent during my speech, but I could see the fury building in his eyes with each revelation. When I finished, he turned to the Prestons with a look that had crushed business opponents for decades. He told them they were lucky I was more forgiving than he was. If it were up to him, he would destroy everything they had built, not through business, but through the social connections that were their lifeblood. He revealed something else then. He had documentation of Richard's firm's questionable billing practices, enough to trigger an ethics investigation. He knew about Christopher's cheating during his medical board's information that could end his career. He had evidence of Victoria's affair with a married senior partner, something that would destroy her carefully crafted reputation. The threats hung in the air like poison gas. My father said he would hold on to this information as insurance. If they ever spoke badly of me, tried to contest the divorce, or made my life difficult in any way, he would release everything. The Prestons, who had weaponized social standing against me for years, suddenly understood what it felt like to be powerless. Margaret was crying now, actual tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. But they weren't tears of remorse for how she had treated me. They were tears of self-pity, of fear of watching her carefully constructed world crumble. I felt nothing for her tears. Every cruel comment, every deliberate exclusion, every moment she had made me feel small had led to this moment. She had created this situation with her snobbery and prejudice. These were simply consequences finally catching up. Daniel made one last attempt to salvage something. He suggested we could work through this, go to counseling, start fresh. He promised he would stand up to his family, that things would be different. But I had heard these promises before, always made after the damage was done, never preventing the next hurt. I told him it was too late. Love wasn't just words spoken in private, but actions taken in public. Every time he had failed to defend me, he had chosen his family over our marriage. He had shown me repeatedly where his loyalties lay, and I had finally accepted the truth. When I said I would be filing for divorce immediately, Daniel's face crumbled. For the first time, he seemed to understand what he was losing. Not just a wife, but someone who had loved him completely, who had been willing to give up everything to build a life with him. His family's approval had cost him something precious, and the realization was written across his face. My father's lawyer stepped forward then with divorce papers he had already prepared. Massachusetts law would ensure a swift separation given the circumstances. Daniel would receive a generous settlement more than fair considering the short duration of our marriage and the prenuptial agreement he had insisted on that now worked in my favor. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Daniel, who had thought he was protecting his assets from a poor teacher, had actually protected me from any claim to the Sinclair fortune. His family's prejudice had been their own financial downfall. As we prepared to leave, Margaret made one final desperate plea. She begged me not to tell anyone about this, not to ruin their reputation in Boston society. The woman who had publicly humiliated me countless times was now begging for discretion. I looked at her, this woman who had wielded social standing like a weapon, and felt only pity. I told her I wouldn't say anything because, unlike them, I didn't need to tear others down to build myself up. Their reputation would remain intact, but they would always know the truth of what they had lost through their own prejudice. My father stood from his wheelchair, showing the strength that had built an empire. He took my arm and we walked toward the door together. Behind us, the Preston family remained frozen in their positions, their world forever changed. At the doorway, I turned back one last time. Daniel stood apart from his family, looking lost and broken. For a moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the one who existed outside his family's influence. But that man had never been strong enough to choose me, and now it was too late. I told him I hoped he would find someone his family deemed worthy. The bitterness in my voice was sharp, but the sadness was sharper. We could have been happy if he had been brave enough to stand up for us. Instead, we were both casualties of his family's snobbery. The last thing I heard as we left was Victoria asking what they were going to tell people. Richard's response was simple and defeated. The truth that they had been fools. It was the first honest thing I had heard from any of them in 5 years. 6 months have passed since that night in the Preston living room. The divorce was finalized quickly and quietly, though the news of our split spread through Boston society like wildfire. The official story was irreconcilable differences, though whispers of the truth circulated among those who mattered. I moved back to California, initially taking residence in the family's Malibu estate, while I figured out my next steps. The house perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific was healing in ways I hadn't expected. Every morning, I watched the sunrise over the ocean, each dawn feeling like a new beginning. My father's recovery continued steadily. The accident had changed him, softened some of his harder edges. We spent long evenings talking about the business, about life, about the choices we make for love. He admitted he had been wrong to pressure me years ago, that my need to find my own way had made me stronger than any inheritance could have. Jason and I developed the relationship we should have always had. As children, we had been close, but my leaving had created a chasm between us. Now working together to establish the East Coast division of Sinclair Industries, we found our rhythm as both siblings and business partners. The company announcement of my appointment as CEO of Sinclair East caused quite a stir. The same Boston families who had whispered about the inadequate teacher married to Daniel Preston suddenly wanted to have lunch to discuss partnerships, to introduce their sons. The invitations I had craved for 5 years now flooded in, but they held no appeal. I kept my base in Boston, purchasing a penthouse with views of the harbor. Not because I had anything to prove, but because I had built a life there outside the Prestons. My teacher friends, my students, the community I had created while being excluded from Daniel's world, these were worth keeping. The teaching position I maintained part-time raised eyebrows in corporate circles. Why would a CEO worth hundreds of millions teach 3rd grade? But Monday and Wednesday mornings still found me in the classroom reading stories and checking homework. It grounded me, reminded me why I had walked away from this life initially. Daniel tried to contact me numerous times in those first months. Letters, emails, flowers sent to my office. Each attempt was returned unopened. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had moved back to his parents' house, that he looked hollow and lost. Part of me felt sympathy, but a larger part remembered all the nights I had looked hollow and lost, while he chose his family over me. The Preston family's fall from grace was swift, if not complete. True to my word, I never spoke publicly about their treatment. But Boston society has a way of knowing things, and their reputation suffered. Margaret resigned from several charity boards citing health reasons. Richard's firm lost 3 major clients in quick succession. Victoria's partnership track stalled mysteriously. Christopher's fellowship applications continued to be rejected. They tried to recover throwing lavish parties and making generous donations, but something had shifted. The same people who had once courted their approval now saw them differently. The family that had judged others so harshly was now being judged themselves. 3 months after the divorce, I attended a charity gala for the Boston Children's Hospital. It was my first major social event since the separation, and I knew the Prestons would be there. They were patrons of the hospital, their name on a wing. I arrived alone wearing a stunning black gown and my grandmother's diamonds. The room actually quieted when I entered conversations stopping mid-sentence. I walked through the crowd with my head high, greeting colleagues from the education sector, fellow CEOs from the tech world, and even some people who had witnessed my humiliation at Preston family events. The Prestons were holding court near the bar when they saw me. Margaret's face went white, then red. Richard straightened his shoulders as if preparing for battle. Victoria and Christopher looked like they wanted to disappear. And Daniel, standing slightly apart from them, looked like he had seen a ghost. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment the noise faded away. He looked older, tired, diminished somehow. The confident man who had swept me off my feet in that coffee shop was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the cost of weakness too late. Margaret approached me during cocktail hour. She looked older too, her perfect facade cracked. She asked if we could talk just for a moment. Against my better judgment, I agreed. She told me she had been seeing a therapist, that she was working on understanding why she had been so cruel. She had grown up believing that protecting her family's status was paramount, that anyone who didn't fit their mold was a threat. She said she was sorry, truly sorry for everything. I listened without interrupting, then told her I appreciated her apology, but that some wounds were too deep to heal with words. I wished her well in her journey of self-discovery, but made it clear that her journey was no longer connected to mine. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away. The evening progressed with the surreal quality of a dream. People who had ignored me at Preston events now sought my attention. Business cards were pressed into my hand, invitations extended, connections offered. The same society that had excluded me now wanted to embrace me, but on my terms this time. During the auction, I bid on and won a week at a private island resort, the same one where the Prestons had vacationed without me the previous year. The irony wasn't lost on anyone when I donated it back to be auctioned again for the children's hospital. Margaret had the grace to look ashamed. As the evening ended, Daniel cornered me near the coat check. He looked desperate, words tumbling out about how he had been in therapy too, how he understood now what he had done, how he would spend the rest of his life regretting his choices. I let him speak, then told him something I had realized during those long California mornings. I didn't hate him. Hate would mean he still had power over my emotions. Instead, I felt indifference, which was somehow worse. The man I had loved had been a fiction, someone I had believed existed beyond his family's influence. The real Daniel had always been the one who chose them over me. He asked if there was any chance, any possibility of starting over. I told him that some endings were actually beginnings in disguise. Our ending had been my beginning, my chance to reclaim the life and self-worth his family had tried to strip away. 6 months later, I met Marcus at a conference on educational technology. He was a professor at MIT, brilliant and kind, with no interest in society connections or family dynasties. He fell in love with Amelia the teacher before he ever knew about Amelia the CEO. When I finally told him about my background, he shrugged and said everyone had baggage. His just happened to be student loans instead of billions. We took things slowly, both of us having been burned before. But Marcus did something Daniel never had. When his family visited from Chicago, working-class people who had sacrificed everything for their children's education, he introduced me proudly, telling them about my teaching first, my business success second. His mother hugged me like I was already family. His father wanted to know if I could help him understand Common Core math to help his grandchildren. The contrast was so stark, it made me cry that night. Marcus held me while I grieved not for what I had lost with the Prestons, but for what I had never had: acceptance, inclusion, the simple dignity of being welcomed. My father adores Marcus, appreciating his intellect and integrity. Jason jokes that Marcus is the brother he actually wanted. Mom is already planning our wedding, though we haven't even been engaged yet. But this time, if it happens, it will be our wedding, not a performance for people who don't actually care about us. The Preston family continues to exist in my peripheral vision, the hazard of living in the same city. I hear about them through the social grapevine. Daniel dated briefly, but nothing stuck. Margaret's charity work has become almost manic, as if she could buy redemption through good works. Richard is considering early retirement. Victoria and Christopher continue their careers successful, but somehow diminished. Last week, I received a letter from Daniel. Just one line. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to love you properly." I didn't respond, but I kept the letter. Not as a trophy or from sentiment, but as a reminder. A reminder that love without courage is just a pretty word, that family without loyalty is just genetics, and that sometimes the greatest gift people can give you is showing you exactly who they are, so you can choose to walk away. The school where I teach part-time is fundraising for a new library. I'm donating it anonymously as always. But I'm naming it after my grandmother, the woman who taught me that dignity isn't granted by others, but claimed by yourself. The Preston wing at the hospital might be bigger, but the stories read in my grandmother's library will teach children something more valuable than money or status, that they are enough just as they are. Every Thanksgiving now, I host dinner at my penthouse. The table is set for 20 teachers from my school, Jason and his girlfriend, my parents, Marcus and his family when they can make it. We're a motley crew, no shared bloodlines or social register credentials. But when we go around the table saying what we're grateful for, the word family comes up repeatedly. Through my window, I can see the lights of Boston twinkling below. Somewhere out there, the Prestons are probably having their own family dinner, the one I was never invited to attend. I wonder if they noticed the empty space where I never got to sit, or if they filled it so quickly they forgot I was ever supposed to be there. But I don't wonder for long. My table is full, surrounded by people who choose to be here, who would notice immediately if I was missing. Marcus is helping my mother in the kitchen. Jason is arguing politics with one of my teacher friends. My father is teaching Marcus's nephew a card trick. This is what family looks like when it's chosen rather than imposed. The exclusive family dinners I was never invited to still happen every week. I know because Margaret sent another letter last month inviting me to join them, saying my place at the table had always been there waiting. I didn't respond to that letter either. Some tables, I've learned, aren't worth sitting at, no matter how exclusive they claim to be. The feast of life is better shared with those who welcome you willingly, not those who only make room when they discover what you're worth. And that billionaire who showed up asking for his daughter. He gave me something more valuable than money or vengeance. He reminded me that I had always belonged somewhere, had always been worthy of love and respect. The Prestons had made me forget that truth, but forgetting something doesn't make it less true. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's proving yourself right. And every morning when I wake up to a life filled with purpose, love, and chosen family, I know exactly how right I was to walk away from that table, where I was never welcome, to find one where I would always belong. What defines your worth in the eyes of others? And more importantly, do you let their definition become your truth? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that they are enough just as they are. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story about finding your worth beyond others' opinions. Thank you for watching, and remember, the most exclusive table in life is the one where you're genuinely wanted, not the one you have to fight to join.